Whoa.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and on today's episode of the Biblical Theology Project, we are scheduled to talk about Leviticus 20, 21, and 22, and I'm excited about getting into these chapters with the regular team of guys that we've got. We've got Greg, as usual, we've got Eric, we've got Micah. Micah, how you doing today?
Doing well. Excited to talk about the Word at the beginning of our work week this week. It's always a refreshing time with you guys.
Well, it's good to see you, and I appreciate that qualification. I'm sure Greg was going to get ready maybe to say that the beginning of the week is, of course, Sunday, but then you got it, so that's good. So we're off to a good start. Eric, how about you? How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I just want to echo what Micah said. It's a good way to start the week, and having a discussion that jumpstarts my brain is really helpful for
I imagine
for the rest of the day.
Good to get the brain jump started. Glad we can help you with that. And Greg, how about you? Your brain started already, or
I'm fine. It's probably best that I say as little as possible.
Yeah.
No, I'm good. Yeah, great.
All right,
ready to get after it.
Tremendous. Well, why don't we just go ahead and get right into it? Leviticus 20, 21, and 22 certainly has some potentially controversial things. I mean, this whole book, of course, has seemingly had things that are potentially controversial. We'll talk about some things that stick out to us. We're not going to read the chapters, so if you're watching this and you're not familiar with the content of these chapters, we would recommend that maybe you press pause and actually just read through these chapters so that you have a familiarity with everything, because we're not going to be able to talk about every single detail. And if there's anything that you wish we would have talked about or that is particularly interesting to you, our dear viewer, feel free to let us know in the comments below. But let's get started with our first question. As we read chapter 20 kind of in whole, we mentioned it a little bit, or at least Eric did, especially about Leviticus 18. What's the connection between these two chapters? I mean, we already read it and talked about 18, but how does 20 connect with what we talked about before?
Well, if you remember in chapter 18, there's a list of different sins that were practiced by the Egyptians and the Canaanites, the nation that Israel left from, and then the nation that they were heading into. And so God is warning them, don't practice these things that these pagan nations have practiced. And God said, the reason why I'm expelling the Canaanites from the land is because they practiced these things. And so Leviticus 18 just gives a list of all the sins, or some of the sins. And then in chapter 20, we see that those sins are brought up again, but yet the punishments for those sins are mentioned here in this chapter. So there's a connection there with punishment, and then the sins, and then the punishments for those sins.
Yeah, I think there's also a connection between individual punishments and corporate punishments going on. So we do get a kind of a corporate punishment that is threatened in Leviticus chapter 18. He just gives a list of, you shall not do these things that the nations that were there before you have been practicing. And the threat there is because if you do these things, the land will vomit you out as well. In Leviticus chapter 20, you have the same corporate threat, the same national threat of consequences. In verse 22, you shall therefore keep my statutes and all my rules and do them, that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. But throughout the passage, when he's telling them things that they are to do and things that they are not to do, he adds with them individual punishments that weren't given in chapter 18. And I think that relationship is important. The individual punishments are meant to restrain the evil of this people. The law, God's law, is a teacher. And the severity of these individual punishments is so that people will fear, and so that people won't practice these things, and so that they won't even get to the point of the land vomiting them out. So I think that relationship between individual punishments and the threatened corporate or national punishment is important here.
Yeah, I don't know. The only thing that I would have to add to that, and it's actually going beyond that, is, we discussed as we looked at chapter 18, how the prohibitions we have no reason to think the prohibitions have changed. Why do we assume the punishments for violating those prohibitions have changed? And again, that might be a whole other argument that we're not prepared to have, but to add to, because you guys have said it so perfectly well, that would be all that I'd have to add to it.
Fair enough. Well, I have a follow-up question. I know a lot of people think that somehow God is unkind or that he's too strict. Do you guys view this as Micah, you said one of the purposes is to fear. Is this being harsh from like an unkind standpoint, or is there some other motivation as you see this, as we're seeing this, these expectations of God for his people in this land, and even the severity of these individual punishments so that they will fear, so they won't be spewed out of the land? Is harsh and unkind and severe the best ways to view this, or is that the only way to view this? I guess I hope that makes sense what I'm asking.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think that if you look at the sins that are included in Leviticus 18, that are again repeated in Leviticus 20, these are sins that just, whoops, I slipped and I committed this sin. I mean, these are sins that are premeditated, sins that they're willful sins, and they're sins that just no one needs to commit. There's no need to have sex with an animal. You don't do that. So I look at these are sins that wouldn't be hard to avoid necessarily. I mean, so I think first of all, what God is requiring is not difficult to fulfill, and also you got to think about who God's dealing with. I mean, God says throughout the Old Testament, you are a stiff-necked and obstinate people. And so to get these people to obey anything, the punishment had to be, I think, I don't know that it was even, I don't know if severe is even the right word. I mean, I think it's just, if you do these things, you'll get what you deserve. I mean, I'm not gonna be light about it. I mean, I'll just, what you do deserves a certain punishment, and you'll get the punishment that you deserve, and that's what's going to happen. So, yeah, I mean, there's more to add. Of course, I'll let these guys chime in, but I think that's, to me, it doesn't really seem overly harsh. And also, I guess maybe the most important thing is, God He loved Israel. Of course, we're speaking of past here. God loved His people. And He wanted them to live holy lives. He wanted them to live good lives. He wanted them to be happy. And to be happy, you have to be holy. And if they acted holy, well, then they would be happy and be able to enjoy their fellowship with God.
If you think that these punishments are severe, I think that says more about you than it does about the punishments. These punishments only seem severe or out of hand to a people that is given over to this kind of licentiousness. And that's exactly the kind of people we are in the modern West today. I think that if you went to people in other cultures at other times in world history, they'd look at these and say, "Oh, that's perfectly reasonable." Perhaps, and I don't know this for sure, you could go even pagan cultures that didn't allow some of these things to happen, and they would look at these and say, "Yeah." And so, yeah, I mean, the only reason that we look at this and say this is just unreasonable is because we're a people who fundamentally believes we can do whatever we want.
Yeah, I hear this question asked, and I can't help but hear, Micah, you'll appreciate this. Remember the whole R.C. Sproul, "What's wrong with you people" thing? If audience, if you haven't seen that, for nothing else, I know Eric doesn't like R.C. Sproul, but it's a hilarious thing.
He has some good stuff.
The reason we're asking this, I agree with Micah, at least in part, is because of the depravity of our heart. But the reason we would ask that is because we don't understand the holiness of God. That is the root of why someone would go, "Well, if I burn my baby, you think I should be killed?" Yeah, as a matter of fact, not because of me, not because of any standard I hold or any morality that my culture holds, but because of the violation of the righteousness and holiness of God. We've said it before, and we're going to keep coming back to it. God is a God of order. God is a God of law. God is a God of right and wrong. And these are deep, grievous violations against that which he has determined is good and right. And so, I don't know, if anything, this is like the Goldilocks punishment. This is just right. This is what's appropriate. Is it too harsh? No. Is it harsh enough? Again, I agree. I wouldn't even use that word. Harsh, it is right. It's what is fitting for violating these things, which kind of goes back to my question. Like, why are we so sudden in our modern day culture? We go, yeah, even Christians who agree with those things are wrong look at these punishments and go, well, hold on, let's not get too out of hand. Like, maybe they ought to, be put on a watch list somewhere or something. I don't know, whatever punishment you think. But I am not ashamed in any way of the punishments that God prescribes here for these things, not because of me, not because of my culture, not because of what I think, but because of God.
I appreciate those thoughts. I do think that severe is probably the right word, but I'm just coming at it from a different angle. It's not that they are severe from our current modern, perspective as modern 21st century Americans. We would think that this is severe, but it is for all the reasons that you guys are describing, that we have made light the problem of sin. And so we don't think that sin is severe. Therefore, we think that these types of consequences, which match the severity of the problem, are overly harsh or are over the top. And I think that people have this problem a lot. We think that we are kinder than the Lord. We think that we are more gracious, more compassionate. And so we think that we'll lessen the penalties and somehow that will be better. These things are poison to this society. And Mike, I really appreciated your answer, not only individually, but to the whole group. And these things can have consequence for the group. And so if anybody is straying and trying to bring others into this this poison, the remedy goes directly to the heart and says, we're just going to cut this out at the root. We're not going to allow this to perpetrate any further. And I think that when people forget this lesson, and I'm not a lawmaker, I'm not in the executive branch, I'm not here to enforce laws, but I think when we're just looking at the biblical perspective, we see that God is saying the law should fit the crime, and it should be swift and appropriate. And when we deviate from that, we invite a whole other host of ills to really just fester in societies. And you think about how many additional problems are caused by us being less severe with things that really should have had a more severe punishment, because quite frankly, the actions themselves were severe. These were severe things. And so we just think, well, if we just kind of give thieves a slap on the wrist and we'll just all put cameras everywhere and locks everywhere and insurance everywhere, just, all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, look at how this is now growing. Whereas if you just deal with thieves directly and clearly, you can live in a place where people don't steal from each other. Like, wouldn't that be better for everybody? We just live in a place where people don't take other people's property. Wouldn't that be a better society? But if you don't deal with the severity of covetousness in the human heart, and quite frankly, put the fear of God in people, say like God won't deal with these things lightly, so neither will we. Then I think you invite rot into societies in general. That would be true of our society and any other society as well. But boy, that really is not a message that a lot of modern people want to hear. We really think our way is better. Treating people, I think this is treating people like human beings, saying like you ought to act like a human being. And if you don't act like a human being, then you don't get to be part of the society anymore. Whereas now we say, well, if you don't act like a human being, we'll put you in a cage, and we'll talk more about that later. But we treat them like animals, and we try and and then we wonder why that doesn't work. When you treat someone like an animal, why they don't come out of that process more like a human being.
I would only add, the mercy of the wicked is cruel. We need to pattern our view of human mercy after
Where's
what
that
God
from?
says
Where's
is merciful. Oh, I just came up with it.
Okay.
It sounds really familiar.
We need to pattern our view of mercy after what God says is merciful. There's a merciful purpose here. Like you were just basically unfolding that the merciful purpose is so that this whole nation can be preserved. But what happens when you don't take these kind of crimes seriously in a nation? Well, you get a whole lot more suffering. So what you thought was mercy is actually not merciful at all. It just allows suffering because of sin to run rampant.
I'll give you an example of this in modern day.
California.
There's been talk. Some politicians have been talking about, and of course, they would never apply this to their own family or anything like that. But they would say, like, if there's some guy out there with a gun, he's going to shoot people. You don't send a police officer out to him. You send a social worker to talk him out of it. Yeah, as he's blowing her head off or whatever. So I think, we've taken, sin is no longer, it's not even in existence anymore in the minds of, many people. Even, modern leaders don't even believe sin is even a real thing anymore. It's just if you do something wrong, it's a chemical imbalance or something. And I'm not saying there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance or anything like that, but sin is at the root of everything, all these issues. And so when you take sin lightly, you get ideas like that, where we don't need police anymore. We just send a social worker in to fix it.
Well, let's move on to our next question. In same chapter, verse 20, let's kind of get into some of the more specifics. In verses 5 and 6, God talks about playing the harlot. What does that mean, and why does God use those words?
Israel made a covenant with God, which was similar to a marriage covenant in some ways, and they were expected to be faithful to him. God said also that he was jealous for his people, just as a husband is jealous for his wife. And because of this, God described idolatry as spiritual harlotry. Israel's unfaithfulness to God was comparable to a wife's unfaithfulness to her husband. And we'll see that idea repeated throughout the New Testament. One thing that you'll notice as you go through the Old Testament is that God speaks as if he's been victimized by his people. God will say things like, you were unfaithful to me. And by unfaithful, he doesn't just mean disobedient, which, of course, that's true. But it's like, you violated my covenant. You have been unfaithful to me in a way like where a wife is unfaithful to her husband. You've treated me this way. How could you treat me this way after all that I've done for you, after how good I've been to you? So you really, the impression I get as I read the Old Testament many times is God, and I know this is maybe goes against certain philosophical ideas about God, but God presents himself not just a few times, but often as a victim of his people's behavior. Now, God's certainly not a helpless victim. We know that. And God exercised punishment, judgment on his people that was, that made the point, he's capable of, giving them justice and things. But I believe this is another example of God presenting himself as the victim of his people's disobedience, as maybe, I don't know if that's a controversial issue or not, but that's the way that I see it.
I think that there's two things to notice here. Yes, like the special covenant that God is in with this people, Israel, where he's betrothed them to himself as a bride to her husband. That's going to be a really important theme that you can trace all throughout Scripture, even culminating in the New Covenant. But there's also like throughout the Old Testament, there's these things that are particularly true for Israel, but like even if you apply them on like a broader level, they're true for other nations as well. They're not Yahweh's bride in the same way. It's not adultery in the same way, but it does show that like underneath all laws of every civilization, there is an inescapably religious element to them. All laws are inescapably religious because they're based on principles of morality. And those principles of morality have to derive from somewhere. There are sins that are not crimes, but certainly all crimes ought to be crimes because at some level they are sinful. We're saying that there is a moral code that is built into the universe that cannot be infringed upon. So the laws of every society essentially testify to the fact that there is a God in heaven. And our nation has a particular, like, not the same kind of relationship that Israel has with him, but our nation has a relationship to him in his justice.
While I agree with everything you guys have said, I want to point out that both of you have earned yourselves multiple demerits, and I haven't earned one yet this episode. So I'm going to just nod my head and agree.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, please allow the record to reflect the fact that
I did not quote any verse
all throughout the New Testament and all throughout the Old Testament.
Well,
God said this, and God said,
I made an illusion.
It was a mere illusion.
You give them way more leash than you give me. This
I
is
didn't
nonsense.
say that I didn't record those demerits, but it is, you are devolving into someone who's on like a game show rather than talk.
It's only not a game show when I'm winning.
The rules are in place simply to try and have us build our biblical theology as we go. But the demerits are noted, so thank you for drawing attention to it. I was going to bring it up. I was just going to wait for you to make your point first, and I didn't know if I was going to hand out demerits to everybody or just those two. But apparently, you're right, Greg. If you add nothing to the show, you will get no demerits. So congratulations on proving that point.
That's my role here, is to add nothing to the show. So I'm fulfilling my role quite well.
He's just here to point out the wrongs of others.
Yes. Well, I guess sometimes that is useful. So let's move on to in verses 1 through 5. We talked about kind of some of the overall punishments, but we get the punishment for anybody who would engage in human sacrifice. We've talked about this sin leading up till now, especially talking about it in Leviticus 18. But why was this sin so grievous in God's eyes? And do you have any other further thoughts on the punishment that God prescribed for this particular sin?
Yeah, this question is related to the previous one, and I think the reason why child sacrifice was and is so grievous to God is because it involves, of course, giving the most precious thing you have to the most wicked and vile thing there is, that is a demon. And as we've talked about before, children are a gift from the Lord. And to receive a gift this precious from the Lord and to turn around and offer the child, when I say offer, I mean murder this child in the most horrendous way imaginable for the sake of a demon, for the sake of making a demon happy. This is despicable beyond words. It's something that God says that he hates with a passion. And it was apparently a regular practice among the Canaanites. I think the Canaanites were not they were not the only people to do this, but of course he's primarily talking about them here. And so this was just absolutely vile and unspeakable. And so I think it's pretty obvious why God hates this passion, or hates this practice with a passion so much.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the reason that God hates it. Regarding the form of the punishment, I think that there's an element of God's desire to restrain evil, even in the form of the punishment. I mean, think about the message that it is sending to those who have to stone this person. I mean, this isn't just like someone being taken into a back room and being administered a lethal injection. This is a public act, and it's an act that the citizens of the nation have to take against this person. They have to pick up these stones with their own hands and testify to the righteousness of God against such things. That's a powerful message. It's a message that would make all of them fear to be involved with anything like this. It's also a message that would demonstrate to the individuals who are throwing the stones just how grievous of a thing idolatry is. Not only is this wrong because it's causing immense suffering and death to someone who, under the eyes of the law, is innocent and helpless, but also it's idolatry. It's something that God hates on that level too, which is actually much worse. So I think that the person who is throwing the stone would have to themselves reckon with how much God hates this. And this is not an easy thing to do, to take a stone in your hand and kill somebody, especially if you're not if you're not predisposed to if you're not predisposed to it.
If you're not a warrior or something.
Yeah, you're not. This is not something that is necessarily easy to do. I was thinking about this as an illustration. This past week, we had a baby rabbit in our yard that my dog maimed. So I had to put it out of its misery, essentially. And I didn't have a gun. Well, I have a gun, but I can't shoot in my neighborhood. So basically, what I had to do is I had to kill it with a shovel. And I even found myself saying, "Wow, this is really personal. This is actually kind of hard to do to reach out your own hand and to take life." And that's an animal, That's an animal. This is picking up a stone and throwing it at a human being and crushing their skull with it. That's profoundly personal, and I think it would testify to each person that's throwing the stone of just how seriously God takes sin.
Yeah. As far as why is this sin so grievous in God's eyes, I like what Eric had to say. I think this is a great argument for those that want to say like all sins are perfectly equal. I don't see any grounds for that in the Bible, and different sins have different punishments. Punishments getting more harsh, if you want to use that term. As far as thoughts on the punishments itself, yeah, I agree with Eric. Having the entire community take part in this it is, if nothing else, a restraining force should they want to participate. Like, I have to take part in stoning this person. How much more will I want to avoid that myself? And implanting in those people a sense of right and wrong, and this is what's appropriate and what isn't based upon God's law. I think it does. I think maybe it was you, Micah, that said something about this isn't being done in like a back room. This isn't a lethal injection. Yeah, what a good. There is a good thing for a society when they witness the consequences of crimes. We don't have hangings anymore, but I think a public display of punishment for breaking laws has a preventative effect on a society, on a culture that we probably have lost today.
As we go through this chapter, we've alluded to it already. One very specific example, but kind of in general for some of the other things we read in this chapter, none of the punishments that we read were jail or prison sentences. Why do you think that was? And you guys have any thoughts about why these punishments didn't include detaining someone or giving them a lengthy timeout or whatever else?
I studied criminal justice in college, and I remember reading about the recidivism rate for people that go to prison. And the recidivism rate is the rate of, like how many people go to prison, get out, and then come back. And it is very, very high. I don't remember this was years ago. But the recidivism rate was something like 80%, I want to say, and I'm not totally positive about that, but it was a very, very high percentage of people who they go to prison and then they get out and then they just go back in shortly thereafter. Prison, as far as what we know about prison, statistically speaking, does not seem to be an effective way to change people for the better. It usually doesn't. Actually, a lot of the time, it makes people worse. So Israel had an alternative to jails and prisons, and it's interesting what it was. It was slavery. Actually, slavery was an alternative to jail. If, for example, a man stole something and was caught, he could be sold into slavery to make restitution. We read about that earlier in Exodus 22, verse 3. So he had to work as a slave to pay off what he stole if he couldn't just pay it back. And sometimes people would steal something and they could pay back what they stole, but sometimes people couldn't. And if they couldn't, then the penalty was you actually had to make restitution for what you did. You actually had to pay the person back what you stole. And in jail, it's common for prisoners to just sit and waste all their time. They just sit and do nothing and just, they're not accomplishing anything. Whereas slaves were required to work and be productive. Serving time in jail often has nothing to do with making restitution for your crime. You're just sitting there not doing anything. On the other hand, prisoners who became slaves, they worked for the purpose of making restitution. There was a specific goal in mind. So prisoners in jails also are surrounded by bad influences, and that's why a lot of the time when people go to jail and prison, they're actually worse when they get out than they were when they went in. However, I guess it could be argued slaves worked for men who, in many cases, lived respectable lives and therefore were probably a good influence on the person, at least better than other criminals would have been. So these are just a few reasons why I think Old Testament slavery, as it's properly understood, was a better method of rehabilitating people than jail sentences or prison sentences. So just some food for thought.
Yeah, what Eric is talking about is sort of a twofold reality of restitution and restoration. For crimes that aren't like the crimes that we see here, which need to be dealt with in the most severe way, or other crimes like murder, things like that. Obviously, offering your child to Moloch is murder too. But so like you either have these really, really severe offenses for which the death penalty is the prescribed punishment, or you have offenses that like stealing, something like that in nature, where the you're not told lock this person in a pen for the rest of for a decade, and then they come out and try to learn how to be a human being again after they get are done with this sentence. No, it's the purpose of these punishments in the Old Testament is primarily punitive, and in order that they might make restitution to the offended party. They're actually having something restored to them. Most of the time, there's nothing restored to an offended party in our day. This isn't actually accomplishing anything. And then they've also tried to take away the punitive aspect too. Like, we're not trying to punish you for what you've done. We're simply trying to. They believe in restorative justice. We're not. The goal isn't to punish you. The goal is totally to rehabilitate you. Well, I mean, I think there might have been elements of rehabilitation that were possible through like the being sold into slavery until you can essentially pay back what you've what you've taken, but the purpose was primarily to pay back the offended party. And then yes, maybe like as a secondary matter, you've gained a skill working for this person, and so maybe now you're in a position where you can be a productive member of society. And then there's another layer of this too. Do you notice how like none of these punishments require the citizenship of Israel to fund these punishments long term? They don't. What do we have with prisons? We have a drain on the tax system. We have the citizenship that's actually bearing the weight of this punishment financially. We have to provide for millions and millions of prisoners, 3 hots and a cot, every day, sometimes indefinitely, for life sentences. And oftentimes these life sentences are for things that should be dealt with the death penalty, where there would be no financial drain. It's the cost of a rope. So there are several things about our justice system currently that don't match the principles and the values that are demonstrated in God's law.
Yeah, I'm not sure what well said, both of you. I'm not sure what I would have to add. I would just say, like, a Christian, as you're considering this, ask yourself what God's law was seeking to achieve. And I think you guys pointed out restoration or prevention of future crimes, depending on the situation. And then what do our modern laws seek to achieve? As you pointed out, I think it seeks to achieve rehabilitation of the individual. But we used to talk about, once they paid their debt to society, there's no debt to society being paid by modern day criminals. And again, as you pointed out, they just continue to be further drains on society as we pay for them to go through whatever rehabilitation process may or may not be happening, often coming out worse criminals than they went in. So, what is God seeking to do through his law? What are we seeking to do through our laws? Are those things even beginning to look like a Venn diagram where they cross over? Doesn't seem like that to me.
As I listen to you guys talk about these things, it sounds to me, and you can correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but it sure sounds to me like all of you guys think that this is a better system than what we currently have. And maybe I'm attributing that to you, but at least as I'm hearing you, you have a lot more positive things to say about this than many people that I might talk to. And you are all well aware, we've talked about it on these episodes many times, of the growing number even of Christians who are kind of disgusted by the Old Testament and think that a lot of this stuff is nasty and gross. In our previous episode, when we did talk about the biblical slavery issue, there was at least more comments than usual about that, and how that terminology. It's hard for modern Americans, especially, to think about slavery with any kind of positive context. It is interesting, though, as you think about kind of the contrasting worldviews. Many modern people, they think that America, who live here, much better than any other place. Although that's shifting. There's an awful lot of people that look at America as a very corrupt, very unjust place and want to tear down all these things. I wonder if that would cause them to say, well, maybe there is some value in stopping the systemic corruption before it gets started. You cut out this cancer to society before it becomes a monolith and becomes much more difficult to deal with. But the others, though, would say we have a much more, optimistic, humanistic view that people, like you were saying before, was we shouldn't send a police officer to gun someone down. We should send a social worker because this is some fruit of systemic ills, and it's a result of poverty or lack of education. And they would say, just kind of as you guys mentioned, all right, well, if in this ancient system, maybe someone would learn a skill from working with a productive member of society. There are many programs in prisons today that, maybe not everybody takes advantage of them, but you don't have to just sit around. You can get an associate's degree, or you could get a business degree, or you can, take advantage of various programs that do exist. So with the hope that you won't, be a part of that recidivism rate, but that you do come out as a functioning, fruitful member of society. And some would view this as just, well, this is completely pessimistic. Okay, maybe even if 80% of the people, if that number's right, go back and can't ever be redeemed, well, what about the 20% of people who can? Like, shouldn't we pay this cost as a society if we value human beings to try and lift up that 20% who can improve themselves with education and opportunity? Isn't that worth it as a society to try and do that? What would you? I mean, have you guys heard any of these types of things, or do you just think that's all nonsense, or is there any value to that perspective? It is possible that someone was in a bad situation and they did something that they shouldn't have done, and had they had the opportunity to improve themselves, instead of being stoned or executed in some other way, that they could have become a productive member of society down the road.
Well, the first thing is that you mentioned, they can get a degree of some kind in prison. That's true. That is a possibility, although that's not really the goal of being in prison, though. It's just something that's kind of like an option if you choose to pursue it or not. Now, if they were required to get a degree, to get some kind of a skill trade, whatever it is, if they were required to do that, that would make more sense. At least I think that'd be heading in a better direction. But as far as I know, those things are not required. It's just, if you want to do this, it's an option. Now, as far as if someone can be a more productive member of society, what about those people that can be rehabilitated, and even if it's only 20% or whatever it is? Well, I guess the question is, like we've already discussed, not every crime is a felony. There are some crimes where if a person stole something, well, they weren't put to death for that in Israel. They were they had to make restitution, and so there are some laws anticipated the person becoming a better, a more productive member of society and being rehabilitated. There were other crimes where it was so heinous that it was just assumed, well, this person needs to be put to death. And I have the human side of me is saying, well, I guess if they did something really bad to me, I would want them to be put to death. If they did something real bad to somebody else, maybe I would be more lenient. So putting my feelings aside, I guess if God felt that this was the best way to go about it, then I guess we have to go with that. But if you, again, God told these people in advance, here are the laws. If you murder somebody, it's eye for eye. Remember, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. If you murder somebody, you're gonna be put to death. If you steal from somebody, well, you have to pay them back and then give them some more in addition to that. It's hard to argue with the eye for eye law, because it's like, well, whatever you do to somebody, that's exactly the same thing is done to you. Therefore, treat your neighbor the way that you want to be treated, because it goes both ways.
Yeah, it all goes back to us thinking that we're more merciful than God. No, I'm not saying that the law to Israel, with all of its aspects that were intended to govern that particular society at that time, like, I'm not saying you can necessarily copy and paste each of those specific laws, but I am saying that the principles that undergird, the principles of justice that undergird the particular applications, those are binding on all peoples at all times. So, like, when God says, God first says to Noah, this isn't just Israel. This is something that he says to Noah. If a man sheds another man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. That's a principle of justice that actually lays the foundation for the exercise of human government after the fall. So these, while you may not, like, because people will say, well, that's just the Old Testament Levitical law, like, it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't, we don't have to apply that exactly in every society. Oh, okay, like, there can be some validity to well, I don't just copy and paste into every modern nation. Some of these laws are conditioned by people in place and time. And, like, you have to take the principles that undergird them and apply them with wisdom to your people and your place and your time. I totally agree with that. But the issue is that the principles don't change. And if we think we're more merciful than God, we're going to have a lot more suffering, not less of it.
Yeah, I think principles, what you pointed out about principles, I completely agree with. But I would also say, I want to go back to goals. What was God's goal in giving these people this law? As I understand it, the goal God was trying to achieve was a holy and righteous nation that reflected his holy and righteous character. And so when we look at our modern day system, what is the goal of our penal system? Our goal seems to be changing the individual, reforming the individual coming out of the system. They are the widget at the end of the line. And we can argue, and people do argue all day long, whether or not the system we have in place for outputting reformed widgets at the end of this process is working or not. Now, I don't think it is, but we can debate it. But I think we have to acknowledge the fact that what we are hoping to achieve coming out of our system doesn't appear to be the same thing that God was looking to achieve with the system he set up. Two different goals, two different outputs, and so we shouldn't be surprised that they aren't functioning the same. If what we're trying to do is come up with a holy and righteous nation that reflects the holy and righteous character of God, we're doing it all wrong in many different ways, and so yeah, I don't see us pursuing the same goals, and so the fact that we have two different ways of doing it doesn't surprise me. And I think what we're trying to do it's compassionate, but it might be misguided. And we're not doing it all that well anyways.
Fair enough. Well, lots more could be said about this, but let's press into chapter 21 just for the sake of time. A lot of things could be said about the first 8 verses in chapter 21, but any of these regulations stand out to you for any particular reason? And if so, why?
Well, the one that stood out to me was the one in verses 1 through 3. God commanded the priests not to defile themselves for a dead person, but he made an exception for close relatives. I should say, though, that no exception was made for the high priest. That's mentioned later on in verse 11. but there was for the other priests. And I think this just shows God's compassion for people. God's an understanding God who, sympathizes with human suffering. Contrary to the belief of many, God does care about human suffering. He is concerned about it. And so we see here that these laws are also reasonable. God is God is taking into account human suffering and people. If you lose a loved one, that's heartbreaking. That's terrible. And so God, is saying to the priests, I'll allow you to to become unclean or whatever for if it's a family member, I'll make an exception for you there. So I just thought that represented God's compassion for his people.
Yeah, I think that this kind of goes back to it's similar to what Israel is supposed to be as a nation with regard to like they're abstaining from sowing two different kinds of seeds in the same field, or they're mixing of fabrics or something like that. They're supposed to be a people who is in every way a living illustration of the separateness, the holiness of God, and what his people are supposed to be to him. That's the same way with the priests. How they grieve is supposed to communicate that message. They're not allowed to defile themselves with a dead person unless it's immediate family. They're also, when they grieve, they're not allowed to make bald patches on their heads, shave off the edges of their beards, or make any cuts on their body. Don't grieve like the pagans do. And then even how they form their own families. In verse 7, they shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who has been defiled. Okay, so those might be two kind of obvious things. But then he says, neither shall they marry a woman who has been divorced from her husband, for the priest is holy to his God. Is it possible that women were divorced from their husbands for righteous reasons under the Old Covenant? Well, there was an allowance made for it. But the priests aren't allowed to marry a woman under those circumstances. And I think that that's because in all of these different areas of life, the priest is supposed to be someone who represents the ideal. Even though divorce was allowed, it was obviously God says, I hate divorce. I'll take a demerit for that. God says, I hate divorce. Even if it's justified, he hates it. So the priests are supposed to be a living illustration of consecration to the Lord. They're supposed to be a foreshadowing of Christ, the ideal human being, the mediator between God and men. So I think that's primarily the purpose of all of these laws. But then also on a totally unrelated note, I do think that there's something interesting here about God's idea of what the family unit is, and what the family unit is, and the idea of leaving and cleaving with your spouse. It's interesting. The priests aren't allowed to defile themselves for the dead among their people. But then verse 2, except for his closest relatives, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, or his virgin sister, who is near to him because she has no husband. For her he may make himself unclean. It's interesting that the caveat is his virgin sister. The idea is when two people come together in marriage, they make a new family. It's not like our idea of, sometimes in some cultures, their idea of family is, me and all of my extended relatives. No, like God shows us pretty clearly what the nuclear family is. When you leave and cleave to your spouse, you are forming a new family unit. That these people are your priority. So I just thought that was interesting. He says his virgin sister, meaning she's still part of his immediate, his immediate family. She hasn't gone out and started a family of her own yet. That's probably unrelated to the point of this passage, but I think it's at least an interesting observation when we think about what family is or how God views the family unit.
You guys were way more profound than me. The question was, what stood out to you? And I was like, well, they called the offering God's food. That stood out to me. So, not nearly as
Any
deep
particular reason why that stood out, Greg?
only because I don't think of the offering as God's food. I think of it more as a propitiation, not something that God would. I just don't. That's not how I conceptualize the offering.
Eric had brought this passage up before, and I think
I knew
he got a demerit for it back then.
Yeah.
Now we're here,
Yeah.
and he talked about, if I remember correctly, about the kind of the fellowship nature that they were sharing a meal with God. Thinking about that conversation from the past, did that make it stand out to you more as you were reading it here? Or
that definitely came to that conversation did come to mind here. And so I will probably tentatively take back my disagreement with Eric from that conversation.
Greg, you don't have to do that.
How about that, Eric?
All right, then I won't. I don't take it back.
All right, let the record show. Greg says, "Eric, you were right again." Is that what
Sure, you can give me that.
Yeah.
Don't you know that the first rule of theological arguments is that you never back down from anything?
That's right.
Greg?
You have to hunker down, dig in the heels. You never give an inch. Alas.
Appreciate
let's move
that,
on.
Greg.
Yeah, let's move on. Verse 9 might stand out to a lot of people. Is this talking about burning the daughter of a priest alive, or is it saying something else?
There's a text that answers this. I think it does, but it's farther ahead. I was reluctant to even put this question in there because we do, I think, get a clear answer later on, but we can't. I would have to take a demerit if we to use the text. But I'll just say this, just to be cautious. We have good reason to think that this is not a command to burn the priest's daughter alive. Burning, yes, but
burn her dead, just not alive.
Yes, I think so. I believe that. I think the body was probably burned after she was put to death for her sin. And so I don't, as I read Scripture, as I read the Old Testament law, I don't get the impression that God ever had Israel burn anybody alive as a punishment. It seems like, going back to, and I forgot to mention this before, but even like stoning to death, although it does involve bringing society together, bringing the people in the society together and killing the person. It's a very graphic kind of thing. It still was actually pretty humane compared to other things, like burning somebody alive is it's a very intense thing.
I'm not asking you for demerits, so please pause the demerits for just 1 second. What script? So that for my own personal edification and possibly for others, what verse are you referring to that you think? I'm not arguing, just wondering where you're going.
Joshua chapter 7.
Yeah.
I can give you the specific verses later on, but it I already said the verses, but or I already said the chapter, but
Again, I'm not trying to walk you into demerit. I want to look it up later.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. I don't like the way that this language is used elsewhere. It makes me think this did not involve Israel burning this person alive. So anyway, I just want to. I'll just say that, leave it at that. Let the guys say what they're going to say.
I would have no issue with it. He doesn't specify when this person is supposed to be burned, so I would have no issue with it if it is burning after some other form of execution. The purpose seems to be a public demonstration of the seriousness that the priestly class is to be treated with, even by the family members of those priests. And I think that this would also be a warning for the priests too. Like, if you neglect raising your children in the fear and the admonition of the Lord, if you don't, that's a later scripture. If you don't disciple your children in the fear of the Lord, if you don't discipline your children and they go off doing these things, well, this is the result. So I think this is a warning for priests. It's a warning for the family members of the priests that there is severe punishment for making a mockery of the priesthood.
Yeah, I don't know is where I'm going to fall. And as I was thinking about this, mulling it over, I'm not making an argument for this, but I was thinking, could this be some sort of brand that she carries? So instead of like burning to death or burning after death, is there just playing through how, in what ways could this be interpreted? Because I don't have an exact answer, but I have no problem with the idea of her being put to death. Not saying that I'm looking forward to the idea of it, but saying I don't disagree with the possibility that this could be saying her body will be burned after she's been killed. We just, it's odd that we don't see any prescription that I can think of for how she is to be killed and then burned, if that's the case.
Well, it does seem potentially odd with all the harsh language about those who would burn their children for Moloch, then to see that there is a prescription to burn their children. So that does lend some, I think, credibility, at least to keep our eyes open, especially as we go on further. A follow-up question, just especially in light of what Eric was saying, we've seen some emphasis on the desire. Joseph, for example, wanted his bones to be brought with them back to the land. Greg, you've mentioned before about some of the desire that we've seen of people to be buried in the land of their ancestors, buried with their people. Now, if this is talking about burning up their remains, does this have any implications on cremation? I know that is something that can be controversial. It's not really on the show sheet, but if this is talking about especially if this is a punishment after a sin worthy of being put to death, then their body is to be burned. Is this then making a statement that would, I don't know, as we keep our eyes open of burning the remains of someone who is dead? Doesn't seem like this would be a positive connotation here, and maybe we don't have enough to say about this. But if it is talking about that, would you guys have thoughts about the practice of cremation, or is that a stretch?
Just for me personally, I think that if we're just using this verse, it seems like that might be reading a bit too much into it. I guess my thinking is that we didn't even actually read what she did. It says in verse 9, also the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by harlotry, she profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. So she's giving herself to be a harlot. And so this is of course, a very vile act. And so it was worthy of death. And that's one of the reasons why I think that, Greg brought up a branding, and I think that's an interesting idea. And I thought I can see, again,
not arguing for it, but
no, I know, but I thought that was an interesting point, and I hadn't thought of that. But I think because harlotry was a capital crime, I think that death was the punishment that was intended here. But as far as cremation, I think the idea of burning the body is simply to, Micah basically said this earlier. It was to show the heinous nature of the crime. Like this is not a trivial thing. This is not a misdemeanor. This is a terrible, disgraceful, shameful act, and the person's body is not even worthy of, normal treat. Like if someone dies normally, they're put, their body's put somewhere, but like it's like almost like desecrating the body, if that's the right word to use, just to show the heinousness of the crime.
Yeah, it appears to be a defiling act in return for a defiling act. So I think it does at least demonstrate something to us about the act of burning a corpse. It's a punishment here. It's a judgment. I don't think we can escape that. Now we have to ask ourselves whether it's a judgment, or if it's negative every time somebody does that, ever in the history of the world. I think because of texts like this and others that speak about how that speak about how we're supposed to treat dead bodies, and because of just the act of burning and its implications, as well as because of the hope of resurrection. I mean, when you lay a body in the tomb, you're doing so, and not to say God won't resurrect burned bodies. He certainly will. It's not what I'm saying. But you're communicating a message when you put a body in a tomb. You're saying God's going to raise this. Christ is going to return. He's going to raise this body up, at least for Christians and Christian burial. That's the message we're communicating, or should be communicating. When you burn a body, I think that's a act with a far different message. Perhaps even if you don't intend it to be a far different message. So I think you can draw implications. I don't know if you can just, from this verse alone, just slam a hard ironclad prohibition on cremation. But I think with the rest of Scripture, it plays its part in giving us pause about how we deal with the dead.
Yeah, whether or not should this be considered when developing a theology around cremation? I would say maybe, perhaps. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that the act of let's say that she's put to death, she's then burnt. If that's what's happening, I think we're all at least in general agreement that maybe probably that's what's going on. I'm not sure that burning the dead body was for the benefit of the body, or if it was meant to communicate something to the people. So let's pretend that we had this law in place now, and all things being equal, a young woman who was a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, but through sinful inclinations fell into this. We put her to death. We burned her body. Does that mean that she's not going to be raised again? I wouldn't want to be making any of those claims, because again, I'm not convinced, based upon what we've read here, that this was about the body so much as it was about the people being the heinousness of what she did being put before them. And so I would say maybe we should consider this as part of our creation or our cremation theology, but I wouldn't want to go all in on this.
Moving on to the last part of this chapter, verses 16 to 24, some might read this and assume that God, has looks down on handicapped people or people who have a physical deformity of some kind. How would you respond to that assumption if someone reads these verses that way?
Well, the first thing to notice is that the passage is referring specifically to the descendants of Aaron approaching, to offer the food or the offerings of their God. So the reason for this, I think, was that these physical defects, again, going back to what we've already talked about before, symbolized spiritual defects and sins. In other words, God doesn't look down on physically handicapped people. That's not the point that he's making here. I think, like some of the other laws we've already looked at, there was a symbolic significance to this law. You can't approach God with any type of, abnormality. Similarly, you can't give an animal that's diseased as a sacrifice to God. So I think it's about symbolizing, just the holiness of God, and how if you're going to approach God, you have to do it in a holy, or I'm trying to find a word I'm trying to be sensitive about this. You can't approach him with any kind of defect, and not that God doesn't look down on people with physical defects, but the defect is symbolic of something. And so I look at this not as God being, mean, or God trying to belittle people, but that, again, we're dealing with the symbolism here of the physical defects. And like leprosy, we already talked about leprosy. I think we were all in agreement that, leprosy is making a point that goes beyond sickness. There's a symbolic aspect to it. So that's the way that I see these passages.
Right. And why do physical defects make that point about sin? It's not because the physical defects are sinful in and of themselves, or God is looking down on the physical defects. It's because the root of everything that is imperfect about our world, including all physical defects or leprosy, or whatever the abnormality is, the root of all of that is sin. It's a living vestige of the fall of Adam and Eve, the curse of sin and death. So, the priesthood, once again, is supposed to represent the ideal humanity standing as the mediator between God and men. There can't be any of this living illustration of these vestiges of the fall, these vestiges of the defects that are because of human sin within the priesthood.
I think this even goes beyond just this, right? Like in our modern day, somebody might read the Bible, and perhaps, I don't know where, but they might come to the conclusion that women weren't allowed to preach on a Sunday morning.
Do you think
And
you're
they go,
fooling us on this one?
See, you see, I didn't reference any specific verse, and you're already going after me. These guys, meanwhile, are giving specific verses, and this is outright discrimination. It's racism. That's what it has to
be. Clearly, racism is at play.
Anyways, my point is, before I was so rudely interrupted, that someone might look at that and go, oh, well, like women aren't good enough. No, like this is God saying, here are the people, here is the qualifications for someone who's going to approach me to do this specific task. Here, if you don't meet these qualifications, then you have other specific tasks that you can be doing, other beautiful, wonderful ways in which you can be serving the Lord, but not in this way. And so, yeah, I see this as part of that. Here are people who are qualified for this thing, but if you're not qualified, there's a whole list of other things. Just because you want to do that thing doesn't make this mean or harsh, or God doesn't like you or doesn't love you or any of those things.
But what if you feel called to that thing, Greg?
Yeah, well, there you go. It's a whole nother conversation.
A conversation we'll have many episodes from now, I'm sure.
Many episodes from now.
In Leviticus chapter 22, what are these holy gifts that are mentioned all throughout verses 1 through 16?
I'll give you a very quick answer. The holy gifts were food offered to God, verse 4. And according to the law, the priests could not eat this food while unclean. Again, we've talked a little bit about this before, so I don't know that we need to get into it too deep here. But yeah, that's if you read verse 4, it becomes fairly clear what the gifts were.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I noted was it was fun, NASB shows that gifts is inserted, so it's just the holy things. So, but yeah, no, I agree.
Well, getting back to something that stood out to you, Greg, in particular from 21, verse 25 in chapter 22 speaks of the food of your God again. Any other conversation that needs to be had about this, or have we made the points that need to be made?
Just really briefly, the offering was not literally God's food. I think Greg had acknowledged that earlier, that he didn't look at it as food, like God's literally consuming this. But because the priests and the offerers ate some of the animal, and the animal was offered to God, this is the impression that I get, it was as if there was like a sharing of a meal with God. It seems like the offering ceremony was a picture of fellowship with God, especially, I think, maybe even more so, the offerings that were given to make atonement. It was almost like, in some cases, the meat. It was like the meal represented this person, coming back into fellowship with God, and which makes sense, because how did people enjoy fellowship with each other in ancient times? Well, the same way that we do today, in some cases, by sharing a meal together. So I'm not saying this applies to all offerings. I'm not saying this is like a universal thing, but I think that's the impression that I get as I read the language about the food of God.
Yeah, I think that we have to remember, once again, that the sacrificial system encompasses means as well as ends. What are the means of achieving communion with God? Well, it's propitiation. So you see a heavy emphasis on propitiation in the sacrificial system. But even the word atonement assumes that the end, or that the telos of these sacrifices is to bring people into one with God. It's literally at one-ment. It assumes that communion is the goal. So when they say this is the bread of God, or this is the food of God, and then you see priests and the offerers eating portions of some of these sacrifices, I think the picture that you're getting is that the sacrificial system is communicating the message that these things are intended to bring you into fellowship with God himself.
Yeah, I think you guys have said it well. Earlier when we had this conversation, or earlier in the discussion, I didn't state it explicitly, so I will here. I think Eric is much more right than I originally gave him credit for.
Well, we appreciate your willingness to amend and grow. Hopefully, that's all of our hope is as we continue through these conversations. Our last question for today, in chapter 22, verse 32, God said, "I am the Lord who sanctifies you." I would ask, how did God do this? I know that there is a lot of modern discussion about sanctification. Maybe that applies to this. Maybe this is a picture of that. Or, of course, maybe we would be running ahead to answer this. But certainly when a lot of people talk about sanctification, there is a spectrum that could be laid out. On one end of the spectrum, God does all of the sanctifying, and we are passive participants. It just happens to us. It's nothing that we do. On the other side of that is that we do all of it. We are very active, and God is not really involved. And then in the middle of that spectrum would be various views on how we kind of participate together. God has a part, we have a part, and it's a synergistic kind of work where we're doing it together. What thoughts do you have?
Well, I just want to explain what God meant here when he said this to Israel. God sanctified Israel by setting them apart as his special people, giving them laws that no other nation had. These laws were unique to Israel. And I also believe personally that God sanctified them by empowering them through his Holy Spirit to obey these laws. Now, I realize the text doesn't explicitly say that, but I think if a person has what I consider a biblical view on the depravity of man, I think everyone will agree that no one can follow God except through his Holy Spirit. And so I think God had to have done that, even if the text doesn't state it. So in one sense, it is God who sanctifies us. And when I say us, I mean not just Israel, but his people in general. God sanctifies us by separating us from the world, enlightening us with his truth, with his word, and empowering us with his Holy Spirit. But I think we also we're responsible for cooperating with God. We have to submit to the work that God is doing in us. And I think that's why, that's why the Bible from beginning to end commands Christians, commands followers of God to pursue sanctification. Pursue this. Don't, like you mentioned, a passive participant. Well, you don't get the impression that believers are just passive participants in this with this repeated, language, these warnings, make sure you're pursuing this, seek this, submit to, the Holy Spirit's work. So, yeah, I don't know how anyone could come to the conclusion that there's no participation required on the part of the believer with all these other texts that are there.
And I think that it's important to note that there's more than one kind of sanctification in Scripture, and they're related. They're related, but they're not exactly identical. This is very clearly talking about a positional sanctification, meaning like he has carved this people out to make holy. That if you go back to the root of that, it's quite literally like to cut. He has carved this people out from the rest of the nations as a peculiar possession for himself, and then that has ethical implications for them and how they act. He sanctifies them or makes them holy unto himself, and therefore they should be holy in their actions. So the two are related, the positional and the progressive. But I think that the positional aspect of sanctification really gets ignored by a lot of people. The same thing is said of believers in Christ, or alluded to at least. In the New Testament, that there is this positional aspect where God has put his seal of ownership on the church, and then that has implications for how the church acts in the world. And then if you're gonna tease out the implications of us being positionally sanctified with like our progressive sanctification, I would absolutely agree that human beings are active participants in their sanctification, but they are active participants through the enabling grace of God. I think that you see that at various points of Scripture that I won't bring up right now. But
yeah, words, ideas, concepts often have more than one meaning. Unfortunately, when we learn one meaning and to the exclusion of the others, we assume that a word must be taken in a particular sense, and there is no other way to interpret that. And so, yes, I would say, as we look at this word, and as we hear, and as we look at it, as we study through the rest of the Bible, we should develop a comprehensive idea of what God meant and what the people meant as they used this word, and then try to understand, based upon the context of the text, what was being said there. And so it seems to me that there is a sense in which God marks someone out as holy. They are sanctified. And then there's another sense in which we need to continue to become sanctified or be made sanctified. And so depending on what we're talking about, God does this thing. In another sense, God is doing it, and we are participating in it. And so I would want the context of the passage to dictate my understanding of it.
Well, guys, interesting conversation as always. That is our show for today. If you're still watching this, you've heard what we think. What do you think? You can let us know in the comments section below. And I am looking forward to meeting with you guys again next time as we continue our trek through the Bible, bit by bit, chapter by chapter, and section by section. But until we see you again, friends, get equipped, obey your King, and glorify your God.
Yeah, well, there you go.